that, but then you have a seat in between. And it's always interesting how you interlace your knees.
And if I can introduce myself, I am Ms. Paula Schumann. I'm the daughter of Town President John Schumann, who has been called away on duty. And I have been asked to step in for him to welcome all of you to our town. And I'd also like to introduce Governor Lewis. Please give him a warm welcome.
Well, I thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a great honor for us here in Columbus and the state of Wisconsin to have President Abraham Lincoln visiting us. And we're going to have lunch with him, and then any discussion you'd like to have with him after lunch, you're welcome to it. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Abraham Lincoln, and also behind Mr. Lincoln is Ulysses S. Grant, who's given us his honor to be here with us. President Lincoln.
see how this terrible war has actually affected this part of this country that I love so well. And when Vernon invited me to come down to Illinois, I didn't think I was going to be able to manage, but one just never knows in a time like this. I want to personally thank the people of Wisconsin for the contribution that they have made. There are many who have given from their substance. And it is the soldier, of course, who puts his life on the line. I never understood quite the difference between an Eastern and a Western soldier until July '62, when Senator Doolittle made an appointment with me to meet a young man who had been shot through the heart at Bull Run a year earlier. He lived in Milwaukee. They found him the following morning, and he wasn't dead. So they sent him home, and he was 14. A year later, he met Senator Doolittle on the train returning to Washington. He had signed up again. Doolittle brought him to my office, and he told me the story. And it narrowly missed his actual heart. And they thought they would never see him again, but he healed. I'd never heard of such a thing, and I asked the board if he would mind removing his military blouse so that I could see the wound. My hand did not cover what was on his back. If that's what Wisconsin people are made of, I'll be eternally grateful. I would like to introduce to you General Grant. General, would you like to say some things? Keep it short, they're hungry.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. Yes, we, of course, I commanded the Western armies for the first 3 years of the war, and we had the finest soldiers that you could imagine, fighting at places like Belmont, Fort Knox, and Shiloh. As I tell the folks, can you imagine if you looked out over this field here, to my right, to your left, can you imagine that field so littered with the bodies of horses and men that one could not walk from here to where the horses are stabled without stepping on those bodies? That's what it looked like after the second day at the Battle of Shiloh. That was in April of '62. Up until that time, we, the President and most of us, thought that this war would not last long, be over soon. Perhaps a couple of victories on our part, and the Southerners would see their error of their ways and return to the Union. But after that battle, we knew it would be a long, hard war. It would not end until the last Confederate army was defeated. And I do thank the President for giving me the opportunity to command all 530,000 soldiers, the largest army, best trained, best equipped in the world. And as I told the President when I met him March 8th at the Executive Mansion, given the proper leadership, there was no doubt in my mind that we will be victorious in the end. So thank you, Wisconsin people, for sending your sons to us to do the fighting. And thank you, President Lincoln, for giving me the opportunity to lead these men. Thank you.
Sit down.
All right. Well, I expect since I'm Commander-in-Chief, you're supposed to follow me through the buffet.
Okay, I think we're going to get going even though some of you are still finishing up eating. As I introduced myself before, I'm Miss Bellboy. I was born in Virginia. My pappy was a plantation owner. He was a slave owner. Our slaves were vote went on. So I was kind of torn between sides as later, as I was a young woman, and I was exposed to some of the Union soldiers that were encamped at my home farm. Some of those soldiers were always talking about how wonderful Wisconsin was, their Wisconsin. Their Wisconsin was green. They had a governor who took care of them. He was giving $5 a month to every troop, which was nobody in our state did that. He made sure that the women that were left home had supplies and things that they could carry on to do their farming. I had an incident with one of the Union soldiers early on when I was 16 years old, and I had to shoot and kill him. He deserved it. I don't have any regrets. I was found not guilty by a jury of my peers, but that stigma kind of followed me through where people thought I was a ruthless spy, and I really wasn't. I was just a champion for my cause, which was beginning my southern states, because I did believe in states' rights. As I grew into an adult woman, I was causing some problems, and I'm not going to mention names, who attempted to send me away because I was in Washington City in prison, and I still was championing my cause, and I guess putting my brassiere out the window and yelling and trying to get people to listen to my side of the story wasn't acceptable, and I was asked to go to England where I was going to take up acting because acting is my passion. On the way over to England, I fell in love with my husband, Sam. He was a naval officer, and I quickly returned with him back to the United States. I ended up, the French called me Belle Rebelle, but I really wasn't a woman of ill repute. I was just a woman that took care of both sides. The men in the South, the men in the North were both chivalrous. Nobody understands when you start talking about our past and how the women actually were going back and forth. There was nothing to write to our President Lincoln and tell him that your husband was ill up in Camp Douglas, and the women would walk from Tennessee up to Chicago and were given permission to go in and tend to their sick husbands. They passed through both sides of the troops, and nobody ever, very rarely ever did the women harm. And the men today, like they did back in 1864, love to talk. And a lot of their talk was not just fake stories. It was about their movements and where they went. And I had a little pony that my father had given me, Fleeter, and I would drive Fleeter in my carriage into camp and give the soldiers goods, baked goods. And at night I would ride Fleeter over to Stonewall Jackson and tell him what I had heard. So that's why they called me a spy. But anyways, today I ended up retiring in this beautiful state of Wisconsin because the troops and the people of Wisconsin were so great. Their governor was wonderful, and nobody ever that you encountered from the state of Wisconsin ever said anything bad about their state. They were proud of it. They were looking forward to going home, and I came home with them. And if you get the opportunity, I'm still up there. My homestead now is on the corner of 13 and 16 up there by Wisconsin Dells. But back then it was called Kilbourne, and I lived out my adult life, raised my 2 children, and eventually died there. So now I'd like to let you know my story. I'd like to introduce you to the greatest governor the state of Wisconsin's ever had. In 1863, he was a lieutenant governor on the Democratic ticket, and in 1864, he ran for governor as a Republican and garnered 9 out of every 10 votes. We need a governor like that today, so I'd like to introduce and welcome Governor James T. Lewis.
You're right, yeah. Well, thank you, and I want to welcome everybody here. I'm Governor Lewis. I lived in Columbus. The Lewis House is still here as a matter of the historical sites in the United States. One of the interesting things about Governor Lewis is that he is one of the people that actually started the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. He was also very instrumental in starting the veterans homes for wounded veterans that were coming back and built in West Dallas. He also established a fair that the finances of that fair would go to finance the cost of the veterans home. and that was the state fair that was first held in Janesville before they moved it into West Allis. But one of the other interesting things about history when you go back on it, one of the big concerns that I've had as governor has been with voter fraud in Wisconsin. And as we all know, the one governor that was elected before Randall had to leave office because they proved that he got votes from areas where there were no voters. So we're trying to address those issues today. But it's with great pleasure that I'm here today to introduce our guest of honor, the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you, Governor. I am so pleased to have this opportunity to stand before you and make a few remarks. I trust it is not expected that I will be saying much of politics. I long ago learned the more a man speaks on that subject, the less I understand him anyway. In fact, sometimes it seems like the more you say one thing, the more the opposition claims you said just the opposite. So I have to be careful what I say, especially now after being re-elected. I know there's some, Wisconsin isn't exactly unified over the current state of political affairs. The reports are that my re-election has brought a new wave of opposition in Wisconsin, but nonetheless, I am happy that we can meet together this day, not in sorrow, but with some gladness of heart. I think that the evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond, the surrender of the principal insurgent armies has given us all hope, whatever our political feelings. Hope that we shall soon see peace, a righteous and a speedy peace, whose joyous expression can hardly any longer be restrained. I think in the midst of all of the exuberance and hopefulness, he from whom all blessings flow must not be forgotten either. In fact, a call for national thanksgiving has already been prepared and will be duly promulgated once we get back to Washington. And we must not forget those whose harder part has given us cause for rejoicing. You know, I myself was near the front. General Grant invited me down. I had the great pleasure of transmitting much of the recent good news to the people. But my friends, no part of the honor, either for plan or execution, belongs to me. It goes to General Grant, to his brave men, to their skillful officers. It's to them it all belongs. I frankly think it would be hard to say whether anything has been so bravely or well done than at Petersburg, Vicksburg, Antietam, Murfreesboro, Gettysburg, many fields of lesser note. And, of course, we cannot forget Uncle Sam's Webb defeat. It seems that they have been everywhere, at all the watery margins, not only out on the open sea or across the broad bay, but up the rapid river, down the narrow muddy bayou, wherever the ground was even a little damp. They have been, and they've made the tracks. I want to tender my thanks to all for this great union and for the principle it lives by, and for man's vast future. I wish to tender my thanks to all. Certainly by all the recent successes due to General Grant and many others. The reinauguration of the National Authority Reconstruction, which frankly has had a large share of my thought from the very beginning, is now pressed upon us so much more closely, and it is fraught with difficulties. We must restore this union so as to make it a union of hearts and hands as well as of states. So whenever I appear before a body of citizens such as this, I feel very strongly tempted to speak to them about their task. I do not think that I can do that without speaking to them regarding what I believe to be the nature of the struggle in which we have been engaged. I have viewed it as an attempt not only to overthrow the Union, but to overthrow the principles upon which it was framed. Those principles for which I am sworn to preserve, and which we are all trying to preserve and to transmit to our children and our children's children, hopefully, forever. The first thing that must be done in order to do that is to maintain the constitutional administration of this government. Now, there's a good deal of objection over some of the results of the war. I'll admit that I am naturally anti-slavery. To me, if slavery was not wrong, then nothing is wrong. It's always been a sentiment with me that all mankind should be free. The difficulty is most of the world is not free. What is freedom? We are now flooded with freedmen. Washington has more freedmen than it has citizens. Shall they be given the franchise? At present, they are free, but as Senator Sherman says, they are free in name only. If a black man is murdered, no matter how many other black men witness it, not a one of them can testify in court on his behalf if a white man did it. They cannot appear on a jury, they cannot vote. What is freedom? Most of the world isn't free. And I must look back to our beginnings as I did before I was ever elected. I think Mr. Jefferson defined it with tolerable distinction. He said some 80-odd years ago, all men are created equal. I think that sums it up in a nutshell. Now, Mr. Jefferson was a slave owner. But I think honor and credit is due to a man who was willing to make a statement in a time of revolutionary struggle that was not merely revolutionary, but was a statement which is true at all times and in all places, and which was in fact an embarrassment to himself. I frankly think it's an eternal maxim and something that we must well remember today as we think about the restoration of this union. It is frankly nothing more than a political application of the Savior's ancient maxim, to do unto others what you would that man should do unto you. Where this application to government was an astounding in our grandfather's generation, the day of Washington and Jefferson, no such principle had ever been established as a foundation. Up until that time, it was simply the divine right of kings, that some men were naturally born with the right to rule others. That was given. Now, of course, we know that democracy had been tried before by the ancient Greeks. If any of you had the privilege of hearing Dr. Everett speak at the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, You heard him refer to that experiment. It didn't last long, some 70 years, and they fell into disarray. Momentous civil war. And when they finally reestablished, it lasted another 70 years and then collapsed. We have now surpassed them by 80, and all the world expected that this war would be our demise. Well, they didn't found their democracy on such principles as we have. In this country, it was built on a sentiment that Christian men must and ought to govern themselves under God. That principle of equality was not in the Greek democracies, not in the Swiss ones, but it is in this one. My idea of a democracy is simply this: as I would not be a slave, I would not have a slave. Whatever differs from that, in my estimation, is no democracy. So a revolution was started 80-odd years ago, when our grandparents were our age. Democracy, and it yet remains the last, and I think best hope on earth. And when it was founded, it was not only the astounding of the world, but it was the model. The French tried it. Of course, they failed. And they've got Napoleon in its place. The Hungarians tried it, and they failed. The Italians tried it. Not that many years ago, the Germans tried it. All of them have failed. This is the only one that survived. And now we find that the great minds of the world, and I'm not one of them, believe that Jefferson was wrong. Mr. Seward was in England before the war, before the elections. He heard Benjamin Disraeli stand in the House of Commons and say something to the effect that we all know that the great minds of the Enlightenment were not so great after all, that they were wrong. We know that all men are not created equal, and that it is all about race. Science has found inferior races. The problem is, not only has the whole world gone that direction, but nearly half of this country has chimed in. Alexander Stephens, in his great cornerstone speech a few years ago, said Jefferson was wrong, and we are founding a great new republic built on the truth that all men are not created equal. And so the world looked at us standing here as a lonely bird on a housetop, believing that we will not give up that old-time sentiment, and they laughed. Apparently, Mr. Seward tells me, the King of Spain looked at us and said, look at those Americans. They're now killing one another. Just what one might have expected from the dregs of the earth. Of course, they believe that we need a better class to rule us. And so, here we find ourselves, after fighting over such an idea, having to reconstruct this nation. Now, we still all believe in liberty, but the principles of 5 years ago and the divisions that we fought over are still there in the public mind, because we do not yet all believe the same thing. When we use that word, with some liberty, still means, just like it did in our grandfather's day, that every man has a right to do as he pleases with himself and the fruit of his labor. But there are others now who believe liberty means some men have the right to do as they please with other men and the fruit of other men's labors. And these are two not only different but opposing ideas, both called by the same name, liberty. Most governments were based practically on a denial of any equal rights among men. They said there's some that are just too ignorant or vicious to have any share in government. Possibly so, said we, but by your system you'll always keep them so, ignorant and vicious. And we proposed to give them all a chance. And we expected that the ignorant would grow wiser, the weak would grow stronger, and all of us would grow happier and better together. And what has been the result? Look, just look at it. Look. There has never been such a race of prosperity under such ideas the world has never seen. Now, there have been those from the beginning who said they didn't mean the black man. Well, what about Delaney, the colored doctor? What about Frederick Douglass, the statesman, if you will? Oh, no, there are exceptions. Science has proven that the black man cannot ascend to the heights of the white. Well, according to our ancient faith, it's our obligation to give them an opportunity to disprove the scientists. And I think they deserve that. I frankly still love the sentiments of those old-time men. It was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe. And I think it was a lofty and a wise and a noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to His creatures, to all of His creatures, to the whole great family of man. Wise statesmen that they were. They knew the tendency of liberty to beget prosperity and prosperity to breed tyranny. And so they enshrined those words in a public statement so that when in the future, when some man or some faction or some interest would raise up his head and say, all men are created equal except this class or that class, they don't deserve the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that their posterity, my friends, you and I, could look up once again to the Declaration of Independence and renew the battle which our fathers began, so that truth and justice, mercy, all of the humane and Christian virtues would never be extinguished in this land, and that no one would hereafter dare to limit or circumscribe that great principle. My friends, that is the task that we have ahead. When I spoke at Gettysburg, they dedicated a cemetery to the men that fell, struggling to see that principle survive. And what I said to them was essentially that it was well and good that we do this, but that in another sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or to take. For us, the living rather to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us. That is ever so more true now. Thank you.